Nope. All right, we are ready to start. We'll stand and pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O heavenly King, comfort, Spirit of truth, who ever present, fillest all things, treasury of good things, and giver of life, come and abide in us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Right, tonight, we are dealing with the 20th century, or the start of the 20th century. We really won't get beyond the First World War too much. But to do that, we got to look back in the past a little further to see what are the things that, what are the ideas that move in the 20th century into action. And so many of these ideas are non-Christian, thus the title being the non-Christian foundation of the 20th century. Now, we don't want to say that all of everything in the 20th century is non-Christian. That's not the point. Of course, you have things within the West that are explicitly non-Christian and desiring to be so, and you have reactions to that. And then you also have those who are just trying to live out their Christian faith simply. But they're still impacted by these things. So it's not that we're making universal claims that everyone thought this way or everyone believed this, but a significant portion of people thought this way, and that affected the decisions people made in the world that affected everyone. So the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and Enlightenment reshaped our perception of reality on a singularly material basis. The scientific method became the standard of attaining knowledge, and all areas of thought were changed by this method. The humanities themselves were changed in how they functioned within the educational system. And I'll be reading sections from the text From Dawn to Decadence, 500 Years of Western Cultural Life by Jacques Barzun. And also we'll be reading tonight sections from Father John Strickland's The Age of Nihilism, his final volume in his series Paradise and Utopia, The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was. But we'll start with Barzun, talking about the humanities. And research was the deceptive word that made humanists devote their efforts exclusively to digging out facts about their subject without ever getting back into it. Nicholas Murray Butler, another university builder of the period, used to relate a telling example. When he was an undergraduate taking a course in the Greek dramatists, the professor opened his first lecture on Euripides by saying, "This is the most interesting play of our author. It contains nearly every irregularity in Greek grammar." It is this fallacy of misplaced significance that continues to deprive the humanities in college of their attractiveness and their practical value. So that's Barzun's critique of how, in a sense, the research approach, the scientific research approach to stories, basically, right? What did it do? It turned Greek plays, right? Instead of looking at the content of the play, the story itself, and what's the story trying to communicate, and ponder that, he's just looking at the words being used and saying, this is the most interesting because it has examples of all the irregular verbs in Greek grammar. That's the fascinating part, right? It's kind of the you miss the forest for the trees saying. In many ways, we just started looking at the individual trees, or without taking note of anything larger than that. in a sense, the grand scheme or the big picture, or it was all down to the minutia, the data. What does the data say? What does the data say? That's where all the arguments are. And so this comes into the humanities even. And basically nobody's talking anything anymore about the meaning of the story, but dissecting the story on some criteria using, in a sense, a research method to dissect the story, which then destroys the meaning of the story originally. You lose it. Now, this also was applied to theology. The materialist explanation of all things became primary concern. Jesus's miracles and claims were refuted or supported by a scientific research approach. Creation of the world by God was also refuted or supported by a scientific approach on both sides. So the creationist young earthers and the evolutionists are both using the same approach of the scientific research to support their particular idea. Does it make sense? Instead of just reading the text to try to understand what is the text trying to say, right? And what have others understood the text as to mean and say, and how has that impacted people's lives and so forth? The scientific approach, in a sense, is the criteria of truth that the text is measured by for both sides on the evolution creation debate. Textual criticism of sacred texts would be used to dispute the claims made in the text or uphold the claims. And so the internal research of the text themselves, these are, of course, things written by hand and transmitted by handwritten documents. And so looking at the texts one generation to the next, and how the text is transmitted and so forth, this is textual criticism. This being used to study all kinds of things, or either to show how religion is flawed or meaningless or made up, or how religion, a specific religion, is superior to another, using the same kind of methodology. Thus, the claims to a perfection of a text is asserted with this kind of method, as found by some in Islam of the Quran, that the Quran is this perfect text. It comes down straight from heaven and received in a form that's never been changed. Therefore, it's perfect. Therefore, it shows that it's divinely inspired. Okay. Some also within Jewish rabbinic thinkers have applied the same methodology to the Torah. The Torah is this perfect text from God. And then also, of course, by some Protestant thinkers concerning the New Testament. That somehow some criteria of the text's perfection, or the fact that it hasn't changed over time or been altered in any way, right? This is a scientific analysis of the text as proof of its truthfulness. The value of the story is lost. Instead of what does the text actually say, you're arguing about textual critical theory, the methodology concerning the text. And what the story is trying to say, the text is trying to say, is secondary. But the value of a story cannot be scientifically calculated. With the focus being scientific, the meaning of the story is lost to the facts of the text or the facts of the story. And in many ways, we all become detectives like CSI or Law and Order, Blue Bloods, we're like police detectives, trying to put together a accurate an accurate portrayal of what really happened. And this is the approach to theology and to the New Testament in the 20th century. Science defined the arena of debate in all fields. Race, ethics, morality, theology, and love had to be scientifically analyzed, meaning arising only by testable data. This approach to seeing reality characterized largely the 20th century. The impact of the Reformation on equalizing spiritual authority to all men also, though, as we've talked about before, translated into the desire to equalize all temporal authority to all men, and then, of course, to all women. We don't have the time to go into the whole debate over women getting a vote and so forth. But again, the debate is framed within an Enlightenment framework, not a Christian framework, but an Enlightenment framework. Even anyone having the vote is framed within an Enlightenment framework. And the framework, in a sense, is how you frame the issue, right? In a sense, limits the discourse of the issue itself, and also, in a sense, the outcome of what possible outcomes there could be by how you frame it. But we don't have time to get into all that on each of these issues. So this movement to place all authority in the individual would mark the further fracturing of Christianity, as we said before, into more and more idiosyncratic forms. This moves the West from all men needing to be able to read the Bible for themselves, as the Reformation founders initially asserted, to all men can do whatever is right for themselves, because the authority is in all men. As we say in the modern world, you do you is the natural outcome of all of this. Since you are your own authority, or you know yourself best. The individual is self-forming, or so the new progressive school model would tell you, as well as what people call the Montessori method also assumed. The child is the one who's forming themselves. And so in these methods, it's the child who takes the lead in educating himself, self-motivated education. Which means, if this was the case for most of us, we'd just be playing video games all the time and saying that it's educational. Yes, Paul, Minecraft all day long. Now you know why Daddy doesn't let video games into the house. The fallacy that you can know yourself better than anyone is still held today. To know yourself in the Christian tradition is understood to be a great work in the spiritual life and difficult, and has more to do with learning how to deny your desires than to pursue them without question. And so the idea of knowing yourself gets inverted from how it was understood in the Christian tradition. It is a pursuit of your desires that shows you who you are. But in traditional Christianity, it is the learning to control your desires, right, that helps you understand who you are. But in the process, those who felt they knew best would then assert their opinions above others and would be followed willingly by those who believed them. Despite the focus on the individual, the 20th century saw the rise of the expert in every matter, from education to baking, along with medicine and fields of science. Consulting the experts became the thing to do, and the phrase to use to show you knew what you were talking about because you had consulted the experts. The 20th century sees the establishment of many things: communism, the end of monarchical power largely, the continuation of republics, which began in the 18th century, and the spread of the idea of democracy. Communism, republics, and democracies all claim to serve the needs or give freedom to the individual. The age of the individual would see the suffering of more people than any other time in history. And what leads up to the 20th century is an era that historians call the 90s. Not the age in which I went to high school, but the 90s, meaning 1890. But this is actually a period of 20 to 30 years, from 1880s roughly into the 1900s. And it's this period of the late 18th century, moving into the 19th century, where the ideas that come to predominate in the 20th century, are being put forward, promulgated, taking root, and taking up adherence. And so we'll look at a few of the thinkers of this period. The first being Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. He died in 1882. Darwinian theory really is 150 years old, 160 years old in many ways. It's not that old of a theory, though it has, as we all know, come to predominate thought in the West. He put forward the idea of the survival of the fittest, as well as natural selection, along with theories of evolution. The age and all these theories did not just stay within the scientific realm of how one species might change into another. These ideas passed on, not necessarily because of Darwin's own desire, but other people taking up Darwin's ideas and applying them to other fields. You had the 20th century then becoming the age of social Darwinism. The survival of the fittest and natural selection being applied to geopolitics and economics. The age of racial superiority of certain races as proven by science because of natural selection or survival of the fittest. You had, at this time, early 20th century, late 18th century, the belief that there was a specific Nordic race that was superior to the Mediterranean race. And this underlied a number of people's thinking, such as Cecil Rhodes. You all have heard his name. You don't even know it, though. Because Cecil Rhodes, driven by this idea of, based on scientific inquiry of the day, that the Nordic race was superior to the Mediterranean race. Therefore, he established in his will in 1903 a scholarship in his name for the benefit of Englishmen, Germanmen, and Americans to study at Oxford, known as the Rhodes Scholarship. World War I would see the removal of Germans from being able to apply to the Rhodes Scholarship. But before that, all of the Nordic peoples, as understood at this time, being English, German, and those Americans who are descended from them, could benefit from this scholarship. This also fed into what became known as eugenics. Inspired by Darwinism's theory of natural selection, his half-cousin, Francis Galton, who dies in 1911, inaugurated the idea that characteristics, that one's characteristics or character is entirely or in the majority caused by your genes. British Eugenics Educational Society was founded in 1907. An American Eugenics Society was founded in 1921. The movement received endorsements from some Protestant and Catholic clergy, not all, but some. Eugenics would inspire this idea that your genes, right? Again, the genes are the thing that produces your character, would inspire state legislation in a number of countries to forcibly sterilize people so they could not reproduce. In War Against the Weak, Edwin Black, this is published in 2003, he says, In its moral dimension, eugenics rejected the doctrine that all human beings were born equal and redefined moral worth purely in terms of genetic fitness. This idea of eugenics was put forward by notable playwright George Bernard Shaw, politicians such as Winston Churchill, and, of course, Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. Of course, the Nazi ideology would be inspired by this same eugenics theory, which by now has lost its impact or its influence in some ways. In other ways, it just puts itself in different kind of clothing. But the idea that you're made in the image of God is gone here. Of course, so that, again, it's not Darwin himself who gives us these things, but his research is an inspiration for these things, taking, in a sense, his theories and applying them to different areas. So we don't want to tar and feather him with the same, with all these people, but the ideas are connected one to another. And Darwinist thinking, of course, marks the 20th century. Another contemporary, this is interesting, I didn't realize this until I was preparing for this lecture. Another contemporary of Darwin was Karl Marx. 1818 to 1883. Darwin dies in 1882. Marx dies in 1883. Of course, everyone is familiar with him. In his Communist Manifesto, he sees history as a struggle between economic classes. History is a continual conflict in his mind. Marx's influence will move nations to go to war for the sake of the proletariat, those who do labor, to overthrow the shackles of, in a sense, the owners of the business or the monarchy, those in power. But it also his ideas will also move countries into more socialist forms of government. The movement from classical liberalism to socialism begins to take place in this period. And again, we'll read from Dawn to Decadence. Classical, in which our author, Barzun, will describe classical liberalism and how it's differentiated from socialism. Liberalism, Barzun says, triumphs on the principle that the best government is that which governs least. Now, for all the Western nations, political wisdom has recast this ideal of liberty into liberality. The shift has thrown the vocabulary into disorder, right? Because the people who are actually liberal, classical liberals, we would call conservatives, and those who are liberals, we would call socialists, or in terms of the classical definitions, which is another trait of the 20th century. The using of words to mean different things without being very clear. Lack of clarity in speech is another mark of the 20th century. In the United States, where liberals are people who favor regulation, entitlements, and every kind of protection, the Republican Party, who calls themselves conservatives, campaigns for far less government, like the old liberals reared on Adam Smith. They oppose as many social programs as they dare. In France, traditionally a much governed country, liberal retains its economic meaning of free markets and is only part of the name of one small semi-conservative party. Left and right suffice to separate the main tendencies. In England, also, the new Liberal Party numbers very few. Again, this is written in the late 90s, this text. So, Conservative and Labour designate the parties that elsewhere are known as conservatives in opposition to social democrats. The political reality, the actual character of the state, does not correspond to any of these labels. It is, on the contrary, a thorough mixture of purposes and former isms that earlier would have seemed incompatible. Nowadays, a sensible voter should call himself a liberal conservative socialist, regardless of the election returns. Changes of party mean only a little more or a little less of each tendency, depending on the matter under consideration. And so Barzan's point is that all Western liberal nations have moved socialist, and thus the influence of Marx. The influence of Marx also, though, is active not just in politics but also in the arts. Who we've already mentioned, George Bernard Shaw. He was an Irish playwright and political activist. He died in 1950, born in 1856. I'm sure you've heard his name, the plays of Shaw, Bernard Shaw. And so we'll go back to Barzan, who talks extensively, spends a lot of time on him as being an influential thinker in this period. And he was heavily influenced, of course, by Marx. Above and beyond Shaw's political propaganda and his arguments in favor of, he's going to list off a bunch of things here, vegetarianism, anti-vivisection. Vivisection is doing experiments on healthy live animals. So he was against using animals for medical experimentation. So his arguments in favor of anti-vegetarianism, anti-vivisection, and more healthful clothing, on top of his universal criticism of doctors, schools, prisons, parents, politicians, actors, bishops, musicians, conductors, Philistines, and the king's censor of plays. And even more central than writing and directing his plays, what preoccupied Shaw was philosophy and religion. He did not belong to any church, nor was he an independent Christian. But he kept redefining in modern terms many of Christ's teachings and the church's dogmas, especially the Catholic, quote, "there is a soul hidden in every dogma," unquote. The word Catholic meant to him what an up-to-date religion should be, meaning universal, meaning everyone's accepting it. A common faith is a necessity for any society that wants internal peace and decent government. This was Shaw's thought. He invoked Jesus in condemning punishment as now administered by law. He declared every birth an immaculate conception. The communion of saints was to him what others have called the great conversation among all thinkers and artists, who with everybody else own a place in the world that is, quote, the temple of the Holy Spirit, unquote. As a member of the pragmatist generation, Shaw was an anti-materialist and an anti-idealist. Reality is not split in two, with one element pushing the other around. The life force is a single animating element, matter and spirit being its aspects of manifestations. Hence, Shaw fought the Darwinists and supported Samuel Butler. Man is self-evolving, as in Nietzsche. Led forward and upward by the masters of reality, artists, statesmen, founders of religion, the superiority of Shaw's Superman will lie in the spontaneous self, which makes for right action without a struggle. So that was a long, but in a sense, the equalizing out to all people is a part of Shaw's, in a sense, the communist movement of making equal all possessions, all things, and so forth for the betterment of everyone is very much present in Shaw's work. And then using religion, right, as, again, something that holds people together, but making it up to date. The religion has to so as to please the people. This is what Shaw is trying to put forward in his work. But he also saw, in a sense, his hopeful attitudes that, in a sense, society could be reformed in some kind of utopia, of course, is obliterated in the aftermath of World War I. And so, again, this is Barzan's discussing Shaw. This utopia did not weather events. At the nadir of the war years, meaning the low point of World War I, Shaw despaired of man's ability to overcome his brutish instincts and his propensity to lie and mouth empty ideals. So, and again, he thought man was self-actualizing, self-evolving. That if you allow man freedom, right, then he will instinctually do what is right, do what is best, right? This idea of the instinct, right? He will pursue the right desire naturally.
Isn't there something that you said about back in, well, just Genesis?
Yes.
We'll use that as an example. That before they had the law, before they had all these things, that people did have an instinctive, they knew killing was wrong. They knew these things were wrong. They knew, generally speaking, how to behave in society.
No. Even in the garden, God gave him a commandment. There's one commandment.
Which
right?
was not to eat off the tree.
Yeah.
But they weren't going around killing themselves either.
No, but they still had a law. Right? Also, you can eat of any fruit, right? But not eat of this. That was the law. That was the guidance, right? And they were like children, and they had to mature. Of course, they broke that commandment, and when, according to the narrative of Genesis, what's the first thing that happens after they get kicked out of the garden?
No.
Cain kills Abel.
Yes. Okay, because then at Noah, the reason why the earth was flooded, because
every thought in man was evil, is what the text says. Every thought in man's heart was evil, and this is why the flood came.
So we weren't naturally good.
We had the potential, right, to be good, but because man has free will, he chooses which direction he goes, towards good or towards evil. And so, but this actually goes back to Rousseau and the Enlightenment thinkers, that man is naturally good, in the sense of that if he's just let alone, he'll do the right thing, right, without any kind of outer intervention. But history doesn't show that, right?
So why is it so easy to believe it?
Well, because it takes away our responsibility for what we do, right? And then if there's a law, then there's something we have to be accountable for. People don't like to be accountable for anything, right? We all know this, right? We don't want to be caught. We don't have to answer for anything, right? But, the Enlightenment thinkers, they're, again, moving away from Christianity, and in a sense, the excesses of the Western form of Christianity that had distortions in it, as we would understand it. And they're rebelling against some of those things rightly that are distortions within Western Christianity from an Orthodox perspective. But again, they don't have balance. They go overboard, right? So yeah, man has the potential for good, but he also has a will that is easily inclined to do evil. And so this sense of you're just going to let kids be and they'll do naturally the best things possible, parents usually know that's ridiculous. But that's the thinking, right? Shaw, Rousseau, and others, right? That this is what man will do. But the World War I basically obliterates this. Shaw put his increasing pessimism in his work Heartbreak House, which appeared in 1920 and shows the end of a world, or the world, with a bang, not a whimper. His last plays all dealt with the same theme of cosmic and human illusion and aimlessness. His estimate was confirmed by seeing the labor government act on Fabian lines and leave society unchanged. Because labor was supposed to be more socialistic, more progressive, changing society for the better. And what do? They don't follow through with what Shaw thinks they're supposed to do. Shaw ended in the mood he had blamed in Shakespeare, both borne down by the chaotic spectacle of man's actions. In his last years, Shaw extolled Russian communism, like Bertrand Russell, the Webbs, and millions of other intellectuals. What we see in the 20th century, it's the artists, in the sense that very much take the lead in the realm of ideas. Literary artists, those who make actual pieces of art, works of art, as we think of them. These are often in a sense, the people on the forefront of thought. And the direction they're going is what the rest of society will follow, right? Whereas in the past, it had been, in the West, it was the clerics, the Bishop of Rome, the bishops, the monks, and so forth. They were the ones on the forefront of thought, and society followed them. This is the shift away from the clergy. The new clergy are the artists, the musicians, the actors, the playwrights, which we could still argue is the same as it is today. But this is where we see this shift, in a sense, materializing rapidly in the 90s of the 1890s and so forth. And Barzan makes note of this. Again, one of the artists being Ibsen. He says, when Ibsen at long last was tolerated on the stage because he had been censored so much for the content in his plays. When Ibsen at long last was tolerated on the stage in this period, his plays supported the new thesis that the most admired virtues and revered institutions were obstacles to the good life. What people revered was an obstacle to the good life. Marriage, always telling the truth, respect for authority, propriety at all costs, those are the things he's objecting to. All ideas in the abstract are causes of disaster to individuals and ultimately in society. In Ibsen, these teachings were not, as in Shaw, coupled with high comedy. Shaw showed this with comedy. Ibsen did not use comedy as the kind of realm of his display, which for some spectators lessens the gravity of the issue. So, in a sense, Ibsen's more in your face than Shaw was, but the same ideas being put forward. Ibsen adapted the 19th century melodrama to his purpose, putting live characters and conflicts made memorable by violence. Under the influence of these new ideas, the theater was reviving after a long coma. Besides Wilde and Shaw, Pinero, Galsworthy, Henry Arthur Jones in England, Strindberg in Sweden, Bruch in France, Hauptmann and Sudermann in Germany, Schnitzler in Austria, and Pirandello in Italy were giving the public cause for scandal and thereby inculcating the new ethos, right? The arts being, right, pushing the barrier, pushing the edge of what is appropriate to be seen, right? In my youth, right, this was occurring in a TV show called Beverly Hills 90210, and also in another show called Doogie Howser. Certain barriers of what would be proper for a teenager to do in a sitcom, right, were being pushed. And once you cross that barrier, right, then the occurrence of such things just became normal. But you had to break that barrier, right? It's the same thing going on in the theater. in the 1890s. An interesting paradox accompanies this course of education. Wilde and other writers, in their capacity as of critics, insisted that art had no duty to teach morality. But here, they all were doing just that by denouncing the old morality as no longer serving moral ends. Obviously, the dictum about art should have said, no duty to teach conventional morality, because they were teaching a morality. It was theirs. It wasn't the traditional morality. So what, again, precision in language. What they said they were doing wasn't what they were doing. They clothed their behavior with certain language, disguising, in a sense, themselves and what they're doing, saying, art isn't here to teach morality, but that's a teaching of morality. What then did the new code command? The answer was not simple. Art itself, not this or that message, was to be the guide of conduct. Art, by its truth, harmony and grace, molded the spirit. Aesthetics was a form of ethics. In a sense, the aesthetics, the how things look, is a form of ethics. In other words, evil is ugly and detestable. Right? Art for art's sake was, in a sense, the new moral code from the artist. Pursuit of what stirs the aesthetics became, in a sense, the purpose. Or put another way, life that is lived instinctually rather than morally. What stirs me up, what, in a sense, inflames desire in me, should therefore then be pursued.
So it's everything we're doing today.
It's everything we're doing today. Of course, it has to come from somewhere.
Right.
Okay, yeah. Of course, this applies not just to art, not just to politics, so forth, but also other moral behavior. And again, back to Barzun. After all this, it should be clear that the sexual revolution, if that is its right name, took place then, meaning in the 90s of this 1880 to 1905 period. The mid-20th century amplified and extended the emancipation that the 90s fought for and began to practice, an emblem of the changed attitude. In 1900, Fitzgerald's translation of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam reappeared after 40 years of obscurity and graced the coffee table, appropriately bound in limp leather. In short, The Joy of Sex is a late 20th century book title, but proclaiming the fact dates from the 90s, meaning the 1890s. That all of that's been going on, right? This is where it's rooted. All the way back over 130 years ago. Another example of the change, we can't, of course, hit everything, but one of that I think will help us kind of really think about what was going on is the example of cremation. Cremation was practiced in ancient times in the Roman Empire, Greece, other places. Hinduism and Jainism prescribe cremation as the normative form of internment or burial. The rise of Christianity in the ancient world saw the end of the practice of cremation in the Roman Empire. Jewish practices, of course, did not allow cremation. It was not a Jewish custom until the modern times in Reformed rabbinic schools. Cremation, of course, is allowed, but this is not a traditional Jewish custom in any way. So when does this change occur? When do we go from burying our dead to cremating them? The 90s. This is what I'll read now is just excerpts from Wikipedia articles on cremation. So this is just I didn't have to do a ton of special research to find this, but in Europe, a movement to reintroduce cremation as a viable method for body disposal, this is how they describe it, even that phrase just makes you cringe, began in the 1870s. This was made possible by the invention of a new furnace technology, which, again, this is another theme in the 20th century, technology that then allows you to do things that you normally wouldn't do. So the technology comes about, but the question, should we use it, never is asked. Oh, we created this thing, let's use it. So the invention of a new furnace technology in contact with Eastern cultures that practiced it. At the time, many proponents believed in the miasma theory, and that the cremation would reduce the bad air. Like there was this, the miasma theory basically was saying that decomposing bodies, right, was putting, in a sense, making bad air and making other people sick. And so this was a problem that needed to be solved. That the bad air was causing disease. These movements were associated with secularism. Again, I'm just reading from Wikipedia. So, and gained a following in cultural and intellectual circles. In Italy, the movement was associated with anti-clericalism and Freemasonry, whereas these were not major themes in the movement in Britain. Sir Henry Thomas, a surgeon and physician to Queen Victoria, was the first and chief proponent of cremation in England. His main reason for supporting cremation was that, quote, it was becoming a necessary sanitary precaution against the propagation of disease among a population daily growing larger in relation to the area it occupied, unquote. That was his words. It's a sanitary problem. In addition, he believed cremation would prevent premature burial, meaning people buried alive, it'd just be burned alive, yeah. It'd be burned alive, reduce the expense of funerals, and that's really the key here. It's cheap. Or it's been made cheap in comparison to burial. Spare mourners the necessity of standing exposed to the weather during interment, because again, at this time, what did you do? You had the funeral, and then you went to the cemetery, and everyone did this, and they buried their dead. They lowered them into the ground and buried them, like Orthodox Christians still do. But everybody did that. But why do you need to stand out in the weather, he thinks, and be exposed to the elements, right? And urns would be safe from vandalism, as opposed to graves, supposedly, grave robbers. He joined with other proponents to form the Cremation Society of Great Britain in 1874. So how was this received? Mainline Protestant denominations first forbade its practice. There was a pushback initially by everyone. But over the 20th century has changed to allow the practice. The Roman Catholic Church lifted the ban on cremation. Again, they were universally against this until the Second Vatican Council allowed priests to officiate at funerals of cremated remains in 1966. Cremation overtook burial as the most common form of interment in the United Kingdom in 1968, Czechoslovakia in 1980, Canada in early 2000s, and the United States in 2016. More than 50% of all burials were by cremation. Why? And this is, again, from Wikipedia. Factors cited include cheaper costs, growth in secular attitudes, and declining opposition in some Christian denominations. It was cheaper. But this also reflects the changing Christian understanding of the person, being body and soul. That the totality of who you are is yourself, body and soul. The Christian teaching of what it meant to be a person was God made you in his image and likeness. That included That meant not just your soul, but also you physically. That you were not complete as a person, except as body and soul united together. Death was never God's intention. And so the separation of the soul and body at death was not God's plan or purpose for humanity. And that's why we say we look for the resurrection of the dead, because that's the restoration of your soul to your body, not a new one, but to your body. The body is not insignificant. And to care for it lovingly and intern it with great respect and reverence was the Christian tradition. But when you lose the importance of who you are as a person, being soul and body, and you get this kind of Gnostic dualism that somehow there's one part of you that's spiritual and another part of you that's physical, and they kind of can be detached from each other. And that what happens spiritually is not significant to what happens physically or vice versa, right? Then your body doesn't matter much.
Is that the reason why they're against organ donors? Being an organ donor?
It's a whole other issue, organ donors, being an organ donor. And that is, again, technology that has come about, very recent in history. And the question is how do you use it appropriately? Again, because you're giving a part of your body, of yourself, to somebody else. And again, we don't have time to get into all that, but there's not an objection to being an organ donor across the board. It's rather, in the Orthodox Church, it's more of the context and the specific organ that we're talking about that there are objections to. But the loss of the understanding of yourself as being body and soul is reflected in the practice of cremation, and that we go from a universal rejection of it to an embrace of it in 100 years. Paul.
So they didn't exactly care about the physical body.
Well, after you die, that's the idea. No, because the body is put into a furnace where it's burnt up, and then what remains is put into a bone crusher and pulverized into powder, and that's what you then get. Which, that being literally what happens, just does not sound like loving care of anyone. But it's cheap, and that's what people, in a sense, this also reflects, in a sense, our preoccupation with money, with wealth, and the saving of money, or using of money for our desires, right? But after we die, right? You can't fulfill your desires because you don't have your body to fulfill your desires in. And so the body's no use, so just get rid of it. And then it shows a loss of the understanding of what the resurrection is. That it's your body that will rise from the grave. So then this takes us to Wagner and Nietzsche. Richard Wagner, again, a contemporary of Marx and Darwin. He dies in 1883. Was a great, famous composer of Germany and a philanderer, a serial adulterer. At the end of his life, he has seems that there is, in a sense, some turn back to Christianity, but very much most of his life and his work is very much running headlong away from Christianity. And then the great admirer of Wagner initially is Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived 1844 and died in 1900. Again, a younger contemporary, a philosopher who saw Wagner as, quote, a mystagogue for the secret doctrines of life and art. That's what Nietzsche initially thought. He changes his mind, though. And we're going to turn to Father John Strickland to look at this, to talk about the relationship between Wagner and Nietzsche, which, again, this is an example. This is an example that displays, in a sense, what's going on culturally in the West in the 20th century. They, in a sense, are the forerunners of everything that will come. Let's see. By the time the musically inclined Nietzsche met him, Wagner had produced some of the most daring and exciting compositions in history. One of these was the explosive prelude to Act 3 of Lohengrin, a melodic adrenaline rush expressing the overpowering desire of a man for his beautiful young bride. But at the end of the prelude, the music changes tempo and transitions into something much more conventional. This was the sequence that came to be known as Wagner's Wedding March. Here comes the bride, bum, bum, ba-dum, right? Isolated from the rest of the opera, the piece would prove to be one of Wagner's most enduring works, even among those who were with no interest in opera or weddings. For instance, millions in the West today would feel cheated if the Wedding March, otherwise known as Here Comes the Bride, were not played when the bride makes her way down the aisle. The song's absence would make the vow I do seem incomplete. And because of this, the composer of such a melody might be considered a champion of marriage, an anchor for one of Christendom's most important social institutions. But nothing could be further from the case. When it came to traditional culture of the West, Wagner turned out to be a believer in nothing. Marriage itself, as an example, serial adultery permeated Wagner's event-filled life. He abandoned his first wife, a modest former actress named Mina, following his unsuccessful experiment in revolution. He actually had to live in exile from Germany after 1848 because he participated in some revolutionary activities. Fleeing the police, he also fled her, his wife. He had, in fact, never been a faithful husband, and when the two later reunited, he continued to conduct infidelities beneath her nose. In the most notorious episode, he fell in love with Cosima von Bülow, the daughter of the composer Franz Liszt, and the wife of a devoted friend named Hans von Bülow. The latter was a conductor, and during Wagner's time of exile, when the composer could not set foot in Germany without being arrested, Hans, the husband of this woman, faithfully advanced the Wagnerian cause in opera house after opera house. This did not prevent the master, Wagner, and that was the way he liked to be referred to as the master, from seducing Cosima and initiating a thinly veiled affair with her. Eventually, she bore Wagner a child while still married to Hans. Then she bore him another, and then another. Wagner saw nothing wrong in this. His creativity demanded inspiration, and he found it in Cosima's arms. When the miserable Hans could take no more of the charade, he did what he considered the honorable thing for a man in his situation to do. This was not to challenge the rake to a duel, as many dishonored husbands of the time would have done. Instead, he valiantly surrendered his wife to the master by granting her a divorce. Hans von Bülow remained a devoted Wagnerian for the remainder of his career. As for Mina, his first wife, all of this broke her heart, and she died a castaway, abandoned and forgotten. Nietzsche found Wagner's infidelities unseemly, but the huge success of the Wedding March grimly impressed on him the hypocrisy of bourgeoisie society. That someone with Wagner's moral character could produce a monument to marital fidelity was simply absurd. In any case, the philosopher was much more intrigued with those of Wagner's compositions that openly subverted conventional morality. These include Tannhäuser, which features an orgy in the opening scene and the enticements of Venus, an actual character, throughout. They also included Tristan and Isolde, which celebrated adultery and discredited moralism. Even bolder was The Ring of the Nibelung, the massive series of operas whose plot celebrates an act of adultery and free love, even to the point of incest. The Ring contained a musical sequence known as the Ride of the Valkyries. This would become equal in popularity to the Wedding March. For Nietzsche, it was a mythical celebration of martial vigor, a reminder of the primitive virtues lost to the West under the civilizing influence of Christianity and humanism. Nietzsche was not a militarist, but he considered warfare necessary for the free operation of what he came to call the will to power. Later in life, he expressed contempt for, quote, humanity when it had forgotten how to wage war. I'm skipping a little bit here. Wagner's music, especially that contained in The Ring, gave expression to a new voice Nietzsche was beginning to hear within himself. He would eventually give the voice a name, Zarathustra, the terrible prophet of a new morality, which was no morality at all, but a destruction of that inherited from Christianity and the secular humanism that followed it. A moral revolutionary like Wagner, Nietzsche had come to look with contempt on the bourgeoisie society of his time. An entirely new culture was needed, one that was vigorous, fearless, and free from the values of the past. Bayreuth promised such a culture, and it was defined by nihilism, or nihilism. The word nihilism was coined by Germans during the 19th century. Its root is nihil, which is Latin meaning nothing. As such, nihilism has come to designate a philosophy of moral conviction that there is nothing of value in existence, that all values are empty and worthless. Human life is fundamentally meaningless. If you'll hold with me, we'll keep sticking with Father John Strickland. Nietzsche was the first to give nihilism a comprehensive philosophical expression. He had learned much from Wagner, perhaps too much. For despite the surging enthusiasm he felt for the master's vision of culture, conversations at Bayreuth often disappointed and even disturbed him. Indeed, many of Wagner's views have been proven by time to be so much heady mental junk. If one reads through the narcissistic content of the composer's innumerable articles on just about every subject under the sun, one finds in them so much of what was wrong with the 19th century thinking. He was not just a Renaissance man in the age of science. He was an inveterate egoist, blinded by contempt for any who failed to take up the Wagnerian cultural cause. He considered Johannes Brahms, for instance, an unskilled idiot. Convinced by modern philosophy and science that Christianity was bankrupt, he held a faddish interest in Buddhism. Though he was capable of most convincing romantic melodies in his operas, his attitude toward the opposite sex was frequently mawkish. He was an aggressive German nationalist at a time when Otto von Bismarck's policy of blood and iron was despoiling Germany's neighbors and upending Europeans' diplomatic balance of power. Most infamously, Wagner was an intransigent anti-Semite, detesting all Jewish influence in modern culture and being callous enough to write openly about it. All these opinions have earned the contempt and censure of historians. Nevertheless, Wagner was Germany's greatest composer of the day, and no one could deny it. As the American Jewish conductor Leonard Bernstein would later put it, this is his word now, quote, Wagner, I hate you, but I hate you on my knees, unquote, because he's bowing to him. Nietzsche himself would eventually come to hate Wagner too. We're going to skip ahead to a conclusion by Father John Strickland. Close to it, that is. Since the 18th century, cultural leaders had rejected Christianity, and more recently, they had rejected belief in God altogether. But the generation of atheists that made up the cultural elite during the twilight of the utopian Christendom still believed in moral absolutes. They believed a just and progressive society could be based on a rationally designed morality. They could design the morality, right? They were wise enough to tinker with the morality to create something better than what Christianity had given them. And But the generation of atheists, they believed a just and progressive society could be based on a rationally designed morality, even if its values were not based in God. Wagner took an important step away from this belief in moral absolutes. In his personal life, as we have seen, and now in his most famous operatic composition, he suggested that morality itself, represented by Wotan's spear, was set against human freedom, was an obstacle to it. The future was open to him who was fearless enough to dispense with morality. As always, Nietzsche was watching breathlessly as the spiritual drama unfolded. So Wagner, though at the end of his career began to look on traditional Christianity with some admiration, in his last play, or his last opera, which I can't remember exactly its title, it'll come up here in a second, actually has communion as one of the elements in it. Very interesting. But this would cause a rupture with Nietzsche. So again, this just a short section here. According to Nietzsche's later account, the composer was lost in one of his typical monologues about his work. The topic was the emerging conception of Parsifal. That's the name of the opera. Suddenly he turned to Nietzsche and expressed a formally undisclosed attraction toward the Christian rite of Holy Communion. He stated his intention of working it piously into the opera story. With this statement, Nietzsche's respect for the master, having endured so many years, finally collapsed. Nietzsche said nothing about his shock, but the master perceived something was wrong. He asked, "Why are you so silent, my friend?" The philosopher said nothing in reply. He completed the walk in silence. After that, he never met Wagner again. Nietzsche would insist for the remainder of his career that Parsifal affair forced him to reject Wagner. But this was not based exclusively on his intellectual disagreement. For Nietzsche, the fateful break with Wagner came just as much from a need to succeed and even to surpass the cultural revolutionary. Nietzsche had a need to become a prophet, indeed the leading prophet of nihilism. So we have this complete rejection of Christianity, but in place of what? Nothing. Nietzsche's famous phrase, "God is dead," was not purely triumphalistic, but it was a recognition of the loss of something. He realized that by losing God, you lost the foundation for morality, ethics, absolute morals. Without God, there can be no point of reference for good or evil. Where does it come from? No ultimate meaning to life. Working out the ramifications of the death of God from a society is then what Nietzsche will do in his writings. So however, rather than confront this terrifying reality, so this was something that other philosophers, in a sense, faced, but they would step back and rationalize, well, you have to have absolutes, but we can define what those are ourselves. We don't need God to do that for us. But for Nietzsche, he saw this as hypocrisy. Rather than confront this terrifying reality, modern philosophers fell back on moral principles that they claimed bound human behavior and gave meaning to human life. Nietzsche rejected this as at best cowardly and at worst philosophically dishonest, embracing the nihilistic consequences of the death of God. He claimed to be modern history's first consistent atheist. What Nietzsche was saying was that the only life worth living is the one based on instinctive and fearless desire, what he would come to call the will to power. This desire gave life its meaning, and in fact, without it, life was meaningless. The entire purpose of Christianity, as he understood it, in its reformational form, was to stifle such desire. Therefore, it was the enemy. In a sense, to curb your passions was the problem in Nietzsche's mind. No, pursue your passions. Pursue any desires you have. As Nike would then say, just do it, right? Very Nietzschean term. Its purpose was to calculate salvation from an invented condition of sinfulness in his mind, and to regulate life accordingly. This often meant placing one's life in the hands of the clergy, whose will to power generated a culture of degradation. The miserable condition of universal guilt was thus legitimated, leading to a system of moral repression and clerical supervision. Under such circumstances, man had learned only to say nay to life, in Nietzsche's mind. This critique was not limited to Christianity, however. It was also directed towards secular humanism. For Nietzsche, the atheistic unanimity of utopian Christendom served only to mask an effort to impose, in Christianity's absence, a new system of rules and restraints that were themselves genealogically tied to Christian morality. So the secular humanists were still tied to Christian morality. And Nietzsche pointed this out. This was true even of revolutionaries who planned to sweep away the old order. For instance, socialism and democracy, the two great political movements of the age, were each respectively traced to the Christian values of philanthropy and equality. Beneath a mask of atheism, therefore, proponents of these and other modern ideologies were really just crypto-Christians. Real liberation required a total break from the legacy of Western values. In fact, it would come to demand the repudiation of values altogether, what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of all values. I'm going to skip over here because it's getting late. The fact that one of the final books produced by the philosopher bore the title, quote, "The Antichrist," tells a great deal about his purpose. Completed just months before his career came to its sudden end, the work is a relentless attack on Christianity from nearly every angle. The main argument, however, is that Christianity subverts human greatness, exhibited in its highest form by what Nietzsche had come to call the Superman. Throughout the history of Christendom, he asserted greatness has been despised. This is especially evident in secular humanism, which during the age of utopia placed such great hopes in progress. Mankind surely does not represent an evolution towards a better or stronger or higher level, as progress is now understood. This is what Nietzsche says. What is good? Whatever augments the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. The weak and the botched shall perish. First principle of our charity, and one should help them to it. What is more harmful than any vice? Practical sympathy for the botched and the weak. Christianity. That is the most harmful thing. In a sense, sympathy, pity. The philosophies of the 18th century, for instance, were well known for their rejection of Christianity, but they all praised Christ's call to love one's neighbor. In the Jefferson Bible, the Francophile former U.S. president had expressed the deepest admiration for the Sermon on the Mount, while rejecting as a matter of course the possibility of any of Christ's miracles. This was the secular humanist's approach. We like what he says, but not what he claims. Not so Nietzsche. In fact, his writing presents the Sermon on the Mount as a tremendous setback in the moral development of the West, because, again, it values pity and human life and selflessness. For the modern Antichrist, there was nothing of value in human life that did not issue from the passionate faculty of man. It's all the pursuit of desire, of passions. So real quick. the end of Nietzsche's life is very telling. He ended his life as the charge of his sister because he went insane. Shortly after writing The Antichrist, he had a mental breakdown and went insane and lived for a number of years, being cared for by his sister and well as his mother. We know almost nothing about this quiet, pious woman, meaning his mother, the widow of a Lutheran minister. But her act of taking the invalid into her home and enduring his catatonic silence marked by occasional screaming fits could only have been motivated by a maternal love and Christian pity, two of the most debilitating values in what the philosopher had called the slave morality. It was observed that for a long time Nietzsche kept muttering the barely discernible phrase, "Mother, I have become stupid." Then he would begin screaming again. The only thing that consoled him was a small music box that some anonymous benefactor brought to him one day. When this was played, he lapsed back into catatonia. The melody it played was Wagner's Wedding March. He ended his life receiving, in a sense, that which he despised. Ideas precede action. What comes in the 20th century was preceded by the ideas that enabled those actions. The balance of power predominated the 19th century in Europe between the great powers. Any feigned concern for one's fellow Christians had long stopped after the Balkans were swallowed up by the Ottomans in the 15th century. Thus, Britain and France allying with the Ottomans against the Russians was not controversial in the Crimean War, but pursued for geopolitical and economic reasons. Power and money, scientific advancement, and the pursuit of progress, or the pursuit of power, not Christianity, had become the dominant forces among the elite in society by the end of the 19th century. The years leading up to the Great War have been called the banquet years, between 1900 and 1914. It was a period of great decadence and the fulfilling of all these things, these desires. In art, it's the period of Cubism. Again, art moving away from its traditional norms further. And this all leading up to the Great War, what we call World War I. And this Great War was chosen not so much by the monarchs, who all worked to prevent it, but it was chosen rather by the bureaucracies that ran the governments and the choices that the bureaucrats made that then, in a sense, forced the hands of each of the countries into war. This is set out in great detail in the work by G.J. Meyer called A World Undone. Man's ego and hubris cast the world into chaos and death, each, in a sense, bureaucrat, thinking they had the right to power, the will to power. World War I ends most of the monarchies who entered the war. They were replacing them. These were then replaced with either communism or the republican forms of government. It would unleash destruction not yet seen in war. Over 8 million would die fighting, 21 million wounded, almost 800 million prisoners or missing, and another 13 million civilians would die. As the French Revolution shattered utopian hopes of the Enlightenment, World War I shattered utopian hopes in the rest of Europe, leading to a cultural malaise, hopelessness, and the cultural nihilism, as foreshadowed by Nietzsche, would take root. The immediate pleasures of the present seemed the only thing that would provide meaning, and thus, after the war, the Roaring Twenties followed World War I as an age of excess and pursuit of pushing beyond moral norms to engage in all forms of whatever one desired. In art, the age of Dada is one of no meaning. Nihilistic and anti-aesthetic and constant critique of everything marks art for the rest of the 20th century. To the point now that art is not just a critique, but a critique of a critique, looking in on itself into oblivion, where art, you look at it, and the question is, you don't even know what it is, unless you're in the circle, knowing the critique of the critique of the critique, right? This is the age of putting a urinal on a pedestal in a museum and calling it art. World War I also saw the end of the Russian monarchy, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas, and rapidly the execution of the royal family. And that is what we will turn to next week. In a sense, the Christian response to the 20th century. Questions?
It's easy to get wrapped up in that. I was in a situation where I was at a classes. I won't go into all the details, but I was here's the 10 Commandments, and if you could reorder the 10 Commandments, what order would you put them in?
Yeah.
And when I took it back to our spiritual leader at the time, I said, so this is what I came up with. He goes, why? God is perfect, and you just messed up what he created. There's a reason why he did it in that order. That's not what I got from the class.
Yeah.
And stuff. So even there, it was do it your way.
Do it your way. Yeah. Because all you have is your way. Because there is nothing else. This is the, and also just the material reality of everything. That's all there is, right? There is nothing spiritual, or what's spiritual has to be also material, right? And so it leaves. This is why we have what people call the crisis of meaning at the moment, because if we've all believed or again, society has followed this down, these ideas down the path through World War I, and then of course World War II, and then throughout all of our own history that we can remember, right? We've all seen kind of how this works itself out into our own day, into this crisis of people having no meaning or coming up with all kinds of things to give meaning, right? So, other questions? Sorry, it's rather a downer of a lecture, as the penultimate lecture. But next week we'll see how Tsar Nicholas faces his own death as an image of Christian hope in the resurrection, and also just his own reign. He's very much maligned in the West, but the things he does during his reign gives you a picture of, in a sense, what a Christian response to all of this is. But also not just him, but the lives of Saint Silouan, the Athonite, Saint Nectarios, my patron saint, Saint Nikolai Velimirovich, Saint John Maximovich, all these saints from the 20th century, right? In a sense, if we're looking for what the answer of the problem is, you find it already in their lives, because they've lived out, in a sense, a response to all of this already. And so that's the source for, in a sense, the inspiration of our own day. So thank you. God bless you all.